Hello everybody, my name is Kara and I tried audiobooks again. So I've talked about several times on my channel how I am really not an auditory learner. I have a really hard time retaining information when it is purely in an audio format, which is why audiobooks have never really been good for me. They were very difficult for me and they just weren't an enjoyable experience for me. Like they're not how I prefer to read. But recently I thought I felt like I should give them another try because I don't know, it was kind of for a silly reason. I felt like I had to justify the fact that they didn't work for me because pretty much everybody, it seems like, on BookTube at least sometimes listens to audiobooks. Like everyone loves audiobooks. And also I'm just very stubborn, and the fact that there was an area of reading that I wasn't good at made me cranky. So that's kind of why I started this little audiobook experiment to see if I still feel the same way. And short answer, I stand by everything I said about audiobooks before. They are still very, very difficult for me. I am still definitely not an auditory-based learner, but there were some surprises for me. So this is going to be kind of an audiobook wrap-up. I wanted to talk about them separately from the other books I've read because it's just like a very different experience for me, and I also wanted to talk about the audio elements specifically. When I was writing these books, I tried not to take the audiobook into consideration for my rating, just because even though that is a part of the reading experience for me, I don't think it's fair to say I didn't like a book if part of the problem was that I didn't like the narrator. Like that doesn't seem fair to me. So that's kind of how I decided to do this. So the first book I read for this experiment was Excellent Women by Barbara Pym, and that was narrated by Jane Entwistle. I gave this one 4 stars. This is a novel by an author, kind of a classic author that I had never even heard of before. And she does like very kind of small town life, very like intimate feeling stories, and we follow our main character. I think her name is Mildred, and we follow the drama that ensues when a new couple moves in, I think next door to her, and just kind of all the little machinations of a small town or a small village in England. And as a story, I really enjoyed this. I really liked the focus on like these very quiet women who everyone kind of takes for granted, and how they actually have this very rich inner life going on, and like I just really liked that. I love when characters like that are given their due. I loved how funny this book was. It was a very like dry kind of humor, which is definitely my thing. I think Barbara Pym gets a lot of comparisons with Jane Austen, and even though I think there are some pretty significant differences between them, I kind of see where that comes from, because it is that very much like you tell a whole story based on a few families or a few people in a town, or like this town itself. And I think Barbara Pym did an excellent job with that. I definitely want to check out more of her work. One difference though between her and Austen is like they both have this very, I think, clear and biting wit, but with Jane Austen, I mean, she can be pretty ruthless sometimes, which is, I think, part of the reason why so many of us enjoy her. But Barbara Pym's humor felt a little gentler. Even when she was talking about like these caricatures of people, or like these really ridiculous characters, I think they were really humanized, and it was like an affectionate kind of making fun of. As for the audio, I really enjoyed it overall. Actually, as far as like the pleasantness of the reading experience, I think this was one of the most successful audiobooks in this experiment for me. But there were a couple of things I noticed that I didn't like so much, and part of this is because I have like very strict ideas about what I think like a good performance is, and I don't know if this is because I am in performance, even though it's not in audiobooks or anything, if that's why I have all of these very set ideas of what a narrator should be doing. But I think that's one of the other reasons audiobooks tend not to work for me, is I have very clear ideas about performance and about characters and everything. I did notice that there were a few things, like the humor in this book didn't always come through from the audio. Like I don't know if the narrator was really playing up like the fact that the main character doesn't know that she's funny, because that is a thing that happens, is Mildred very much unaware for a good part of the book about like how clever and funny she really is. So I don't know if that's what she was trying to do, but like some of this book was like hysterical, and you couldn't really tell that from the narrator. Like I had to kind of picture reading it in order to really enjoy the humor. And another thing is there are 2 characters in this book that are kind of like minor love interests for some of the other characters, and the way that the narrator did their voices was just like completely unattractive, to the point where it really took me out of the story, and I was like, wait, these are supposed to be like young, attractive guys, and she's giving them this voice? Like, okay. So that's like very much personal preference. And then the other thing about this is I mentioned how soothing the audio was, which was great, except that I kept falling asleep while listening to this book. Now keep in mind, I was listening to this one primarily over an exceptionally exhausting weekend for me. Like normally I would not have been that tired while I was listening to it, but I would like to put it on while I was taking a break, or sometimes like a few hours before I planned to go to bed, and I would just wake up like 40 minutes later and have to rewind through all of that because I had just fallen asleep, because Jane Entwistle has such a soothing voice. The next one I tried was A Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll. is how the narrator kept saying it, and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This was narrated by Ian Holm. This one I did not like at all. I was reading this classic because I really want to get to another series of books that is partially based on this one, so I thought I should, you know, read the original. I knew like the very basic outline of the story, and I still think that as a concept, this book is interesting. But that was pretty much the only thing I liked. I found it really boring and confusing and kind of pointless, honestly. Like, I think if you go into this and you have no idea of the basic premise of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I think you could enjoy this. But if you do know, like, the main summary of the story, I think it's a lot less enjoyable. And also, like, another thing I always hear about the story is, like, the morality and how it explores morality in such interesting ways. And I personally did not get that at all from this. It just felt kind of pointless. Like, I didn't understand what this story was trying to say. If it was, like, supposed to be a Lord of the Flies situation where it's like, oh, look at how evil any human is capable of being. Or if it was supposed to be, like, the opposite. And it's, like, the importance of individual choices and how, like, people are free to choose if they are going to be a good person or a bad person. And I also, like, I mentioned how confusing this book was. So, like, I didn't understand why this was told as, like, a frame story within a frame story. Like, there were, like, multiple layers here of, like, characters who were just completely unnecessary, except as a vehicle to tell us the story. Like, the very, very last chunk of the book is when we finally get to the explanation for what has been happening. And it's just, like, this complete info dump of, like, oh, this is what was going on the whole time. And again, if you know the story of this classic, I don't think that's really worth it. As for the audio, I found this one a little harder to understand. I don't know if it was a specific kind of British accent that the narrator had, but it was something I had to really focus on a lot, like even a lot more than I normally would with listening to something. So it took a lot more effort for this one. I do think the narrator was very good at differentiating voices for different characters, which was a big help, especially when I didn't understand why so many of these characters were even here. I could at least sometimes tell them apart, but I just really didn't like this book at all. I actually switched to an ebook halfway through. I'm like, I don't even like reading on ebooks. Like, I don't even have an e-reader, so I had to read it on my phone, which was a real pain for me. So, like, I just got so frustrated with this audio because it was so difficult for me to understand sometimes. Like, I had to keep going back and re-listening to things, and for a story that I was kind of hating at that point, it was not a fun experience. So I gave this one 2.5 stars. I don't remember if I mentioned that, but yeah, not a good time. The next one I listened to was Flunked by Jen Kalanita, and this was narrated by Kristen Condon. This is the first book in the Fairy Tale Reform School series, and this one I gave 3 stars. I think this was a lot of fun. Pretty cute. We follow our main character, who I cannot remember the name of. That's another thing with audiobooks that's really hard for me, is I forget details and character names so much more quickly. I normally have a very good memory for books and just not on audio. So our main character, she's been caught stealing, and she's been doing this in order to support her family because they're very poor. So she gets sent to Fairy Tale Reform School, which is basically where some of the villains from the fairy tales, like the Evil Queen, they have, like, put together this reform school because to show that they have changed their ways. Our main character really doesn't want to get sent there. She really hates the royal families. This world is ruled over by 4 different princesses, and our main character really doesn't like them for very good reasons, we find out. But once she's at the school, she starts realizing that there might be something sinister going on with the school. Like, maybe the villains in charge aren't as reformed as they want everyone to think they are. Even though some of it was quite predictable, it didn't bother me too much. There were actually a couple of, like, characters introduced that were taken in directions that I actually really liked, that were that I did not see coming, so that was really nice. Also, there's this, like, troll or ogre named Maxine, who is, like, the sweetest little bean, and I want the world for her. She was, like, one of my favorite parts of the book. And I also think the setting was really interesting, like the kind of fantasy celebrities and kind of, like, how realistic that was. How, like, they would be, like, marketing their own shampoo and stuff, and how, like, some little girls would be, like, so all over it and they want to, like, grow up to be just like the princesses, versus, like, how some other people would feel about the royal families. This is just ridiculous. I'm gonna look up the main character's name because it is stressing me out not knowing. Jilly. The main character was named Jilly. I also really like seeing Jilly's development and how she started to realize that maybe some of the assumptions she had about other characters, especially the royals, maybe those aren't completely justified, or at least not all of them are. The main issue I had with this book is just I had very little emotional connection to it. Like, even the characters that I enjoyed, it was in kind of a casual way, so that's kind of why this ended up with a 3-star rating. Like, I liked it, it was pleasant. As for the audio, I think a lot of it was quite over dramatic, but in the most fun way. I feel like Kristen Condon was just having the time of her life with some of these like really dramatic villain voices, and I actually really loved it. I'm not sure I would love it in every kind of story, but because of the kind of setting and the kind of story this was, I think it actually really worked. Next, I listened to The Fairy Guardian by Rachel Morgan, and that was narrated by Georgiana Marie and Zach Villa. And I gave this one 2 stars. Really didn't like this one. This actually would have been a 1-star, because I try to say 1 stars for books that like have something actually harmful or problematic about them, and this was just like, this book wasn't problematic, I just didn't enjoy a single thing about it. This is the first book in the Creepy Hollow series, and we follow a main character who, again, I cannot remember. Violet. I think her name was Violet. She's a fairy guardian, and that means that she's basically, she's sent to like protect people in the human world from like these fairy creatures that show up and try to wreak havoc. But of course humans aren't supposed to know about her. And then one day a human boy gets taken with her to the fairy realm, and he's not supposed to be, and then drama happens, and of course they fall in love, and it's ridiculous. And I don't really know how to summarize this book, because one of the issues I had with it is that it was really, really boring, but it also felt like there were 3 different stories that were all trying to happen in the same book. Like this book just, it kept going and going. Like we'd get to a point where I thought we had like addressed the main plot element, and then it would go in a completely different direction. I thought the characters were also super flat. The romance was just insufferable, and like I think part of that is that the narrator did like the absolute worst voice I have ever heard for a young like guy kind of character. He sounded like a cartoon surfer who was also high and falling asleep and also like 10 years old pretending to be 16. That's like the best way I can describe it, but it was just really, really irritating. So I didn't like the voice she did for him, and I think that was part of the reason I didn't like the romance. But even if I had been reading this physically, I just don't think the 2 characters had much chemistry. And also like the dialogue, like just the writing of the dialogue, not even the delivery, was just so cheesy. The only positives I really have about this book are that 1, they point out that carving your initials in trees is actually really, really bad. Like, don't do that, please, you guys. It's really, really bad for the trees. And 2, there were a couple of character developments that I think were actually very interesting and I was like pretty impressed with. But other than that, I did not like this book at all. And I already talked about how I didn't like the audio. I listened to samples before I listened to any of these to make sure I didn't like hate the narrator's voice. And I didn't like hate her voice exactly, but I definitely think I should have listened to a longer part of the sample before I decided to download this one. And I already mentioned how much I hated her voices for the male characters. Yeah, this was not a good experience. Next, I had what was definitely my most positive audiobook experience, and that was The Running Dream by Wendelin Van Draanen. And the narrator for that one is Laura Flanagan. And I gave this book 5 stars. I absolutely loved this. Actually, the reason I listened to this one, and I'll get into this a little later in the video where I talk about kind of my criteria for like choosing audiobooks, but I had almost taken this book off my TBR a couple times before, and I had just been planning to get it from the library, and I was like, well, you know, like I think it'll be like a 3 stars. It'll be like fine, but I wasn't anticipating loving it. And I really, really loved this. So this is about our main character, Jessica. I think the fact that I can easily remember her name is another testament to how much I enjoyed this book. But anyway, we follow our main character, Jessica, and right at the beginning of the book, we find out that she has been in an accident and she has lost one of her legs. Jessica is distraught when this happens because she is a runner. That is her most important hobby. That is part of her identity. It is one of the things that she loves most in the world, and now she thinks that she'll never be able to run again. And so this whole book is about Jessica's recovery and coming to terms with the fact that her body is very different now, and that that's okay, that she can still love herself, she can still do things that she loves. And this book is also about Jessica making friends with a girl named Rosa, and Rosa is a girl in her class who has cerebral palsy, and Jessica is faced with the very uncomfortable truth that she might have never even talked to Rosa if she were not also temporarily in a wheelchair. So one of the things I loved about this book were the characters, and especially the friendships. Jessica and her best friend Fiona are just they have such a wonderful friendship. Even though Fiona does still make mistakes in how she approaches her friend who is now disabled, you can tell that these girls just really care about each other so much. And I also loved Rosa and Jessica's friendship too. I just think it was so beautifully done, and I don't feel like the book I don't think it ever framed the story as like Jessica bringing light to a poor disabled person's life, or like Rosa like fixing Jessica, or like them like fixing each other or anything. I'm not an Own Voices reviewer for disability, but it didn't seem like that kind of story. I'll try to remember who it was and link it, but one of the reviews on Goodreads said like, oh, is this the way that a group of people trained in disability representation and like accommodation, is this how they would have addressed this issue? No. But is this how a 16-year-old girl who wants to help her friend would have addressed this issue? Yes. And I just think that was a very, very good, succinct way to put it, because like with Fiona, Jessica doesn't always approach things in the most correct way, or in the way that we would want to see those things addressed today. But I think she does it with good intentions and with good outcomes too. Like, it's not like she puts Rosa in an uncomfortable situation based on her lack of knowledge about Rosa's life or illness. I also think that the storytelling of this book was just so good, like the writing and just like the overall plot. Like, this book made me understand why people love running, which is kind of amazing. I am definitely not a fan of running, and I think one of the marks of a really well done story is when a book can make you understand a character's interest in something when that interest doesn't overlap with yours at all. Like, I really understood why Jessica loved running and why this would be such a powerful thing for her, and why that's something that she could not lose, that she would not want to lose. And another thing I really appreciate about the writing is like how, like, all the small details and how believable this felt as a school setting. I don't know, like, that's something I sometimes notice with contemporaries especially, is like the author is sort of writing it as like, everybody knows what a high school looks like, I don't need to put that much effort into it. But I feel like Winston Van Drenen really did that. Like, it still felt like a very real place, and even though this book isn't like all about the setting or anything, it still felt like a real high school, like even down to things like how much prom tickets would probably cost. Like, all of those little details felt very much like, oh yeah, I could see a real high school being run this way. And yeah, I don't know what else to say about this book. I loved it so much. I cried a lot, a lot while listening to this one. But it was such a powerful story, really hopeful while also not like sugary or like oversimplifying things. Like, Jessica, she goes through a lot, and she goes through some really depressed periods, and it's like you really understand where she's coming from with her emotions and with why she's doing the things she's doing. And when she lashes out at people, you know, she's not excused for it, but you understand why she's doing it and you can forgive her for it. And just, this book was so good. As for the audio, Laura Flanagan is an amazing artist. Like, this is kind of what I think of as performance, like voice performance. It was funny because it was a little bit of a rocky start at the very beginning. Like, the first couple minutes of the audiobook, I was like, ooh, I don't know if I'm gonna get on with her style as much as I thought, because it felt a little bit over dramatized. But within like 20 or 30 minutes, I was into it. I was really enjoying it. And by halfway through this audiobook, I was finding excuses to listen to it, which has not ever happened for me before. Something I think she did exceptionally well is the emotional delivery. Like, when we were told that a character was laughing or was crying, I think Laura Flanagan really built that into her performance. Like, she had very convincing sounding laughs and tears in this audiobook. I just think she did a fantastic job with this audiobook. I'm buying a physical copy of the book because I loved The Running Dream so much, which is just, isn't that like a wonderful feeling when it's something like a book that you think is gonna be like okay and then it ends up becoming a new favorite? Like, this was amazing. And finally, the last audiobook I'm going to talk about today is De Profundis by Oscar Wilde, and that was narrated by Simon Russell Beale. This is a work of nonfiction. It is actually the letter that Oscar Wilde wrote to his former lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, also known as Bosie, I think is how you say that. And he was writing this from Reading Jail, which was where he was put after he was convicted of homosexuality. And this was a really hard listen for a lot of obvious reasons. It was really sad and very difficult, but I am very glad I read it. I ended up giving this one 4 stars, but that's kind of with a caveat, because even though I really liked Simon Russell Beale's performance, I think he did an exceptionally good job of really like performing it as a letter, like actually like acting, you know, not just reading something in a performative kind of voice. Which makes sense because Simon Russell Beale is an actor. So even though I really liked his delivery, I think Oscar Wilde's language and writing is so rich and complex and layered that I think I would get a lot more detail out of the writing if I read this physically. So this is one I want to come back to. It also made me incredibly angry at Lord Alfred Douglas for the way that he treated Oscar Wilde during their relationship. I'm not talking about like after the conviction, because of course when such terrible things were done to people for being gay, it makes sense that he wouldn't like stand up in support of Oscar Wilde or anything. So I'm not talking about that. I just mean the way that Douglas would treat Oscar Wilde. He's the reason that he was in debt. Like, he didn't seem to even care about him. Like, the things that he said to him when he was really, really sick, and like the fact that he would never take care of him. He would never do anything to make him happy while he expected all these like extravagant gifts, and basically like Oscar Wilde devoting his entire like existence to taking care of him and pampering him and like spending all this money on him. It was really, really hard to listen to, and I know this is like, obviously this is from the perspective of Oscar Wilde, so I understand that it could be somewhat biased, but if even a small part of what Oscar Wilde is describing is to be taken at face value, then I am just furious about it. And aside from that, I really liked Oscar Wilde's musings on like art and poetry and the importance of those. I thought those were really interesting, and I also thought it was really interesting his perspective on suffering. I don't agree with all of it, but I understand why. I understand why he feels the way he does, and I do think he made some really interesting points about like the value of suffering, if you can call it that, or like the poetry or the beauty of sorrow. Again, I don't agree with all of it, but it was definitely interesting to hear his take on it, and I mean, given what he went through, I think it's amazing that he came out of it feeling the way he did. So yeah, 4 stars, but definitely want to reread it physically, although again, it was so hard to listen to even. I think in some ways it was even harder to listen to than it would be to read, because it's like you're listening to somebody tell you this. Like, it felt very personal, which I think was a benefit for such a personal like letter or essay. But yeah, definitely not an easy listening experience. Okay, so to kind of sum up a little bit, how do I feel about audiobooks now going forward? Am I still going to try them? And I really think I am. I think there are some cases where it could be a very useful tool for me, but with a couple of those exceptions that I mentioned, it's not really an enjoyable reading experience for me. Like, it's not something I look forward to. It's not something I enjoy. It's more of a chore that I have to remind myself to do. But one thing I do think it was really useful for, and actually that's how I chose several of these books, is for getting books off my TBR that I'm not really confident I'll love. Like, I'm not thinking I'm gonna hate them, or I would just take them off my TBR list, but I'm not exactly excited about reading them either. And so for that reason, they're ones that I don't necessarily want to buy, or like if my library doesn't have them or anything. Like, I don't want to spend money on it, so this might be a great way to get them off the list. And in a couple cases it was. Like, The Fairy Guardian has been on my list for 3 or 4 years. I also mentioned my really strong preferences as far as performers and narrators go, so that's another consideration. And there's some just types of stories that I think are more suited to audio. Like, there was a reason I chose De Profundis to listen to on audio. For one thing, it's Oscar Wilde, and I'm reasonably confident I'll enjoy everything he's written, but also it felt like a very personal thing, and for that reason I was like, maybe it would be interesting to hear it as an audiobook. But like, for example, like, I don't ever plan on listening to Sadie by Courtney Summers as an audiobook. I know everyone talks about how amazing it is, but I just have no interest in that kind of story via audio. And there are also some things that just make audiobooks very difficult for me in general. Like, I find it really, really hard to multitask while listening to something, or while listening to an audiobook specifically. Like, with music I'm fine, but with audiobooks, I just can't really do it. I mean, even things like knitting, where I was not doing an overly complicated pattern, it was one I knew really well, it was really actually difficult for me to focus on that enough to continue doing it while also paying attention to a story. Like, I just have a really hard time retaining any information when it's only verbal, so to add another activity to that was really hard for me, which kind of sucked, because that was one of the primary reasons I was like, audiobooks would be great for me if I could make myself do them, is because I was like, I'd be able to like get reading done while I was doing other stuff, and the answer is like, not really. Or at least in very specific cases. Another thing is, I really, really hate not knowing how things are spelled. And that sounds a little bit overly particular, but I mean, like, it really stressed me out that I didn't remember like any of these main characters' names, because there have definitely been times where I've had to look up the protagonist's name when I was doing a wrap-up or a review before. But in general, I have a pretty good memory for books and for details of books, and a lot of these stories, like, I'm already forgetting details. And because I'm such a visual learner, I think seeing the words on the page really helps me remember characters and remember place names, especially when you have more complex, like a lot of people in the cast of characters or something. So that also made it really hard. So I guess the bottom line is, yes, I am going to still try some audiobooks. I think it can be a very useful tool for me, but it's not like a fun activity necessarily. I mean, except for a couple of the ones I mentioned, like The Running Dream was incredible. And like, that's like the experience that I would love to have with audiobooks. but I just don't anticipate that happening a lot. We'll see. I don't think audiobooks is ever going to overtake physical reading as my preferred format, which is fine with me. I really like physically reading, and you know, that's okay. So thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!